There's a phrase or saying, I guess it's taken from the Bible, but I see it a lot around the holidays. It goes something like this: peace on earth and goodwill to all men. I've always liked that phrase, in the same way I always liked the idea of winning the lottery or a Sam Adams tall boy that never runs out of beer, no matter how much I drink. Awesome idea, but it's never going to happen. Now don't get me wrong, it sure is a nice thought, but having worked as a homicide detective for almost 15 years, I can tell you firsthand that crime doesn't take a break around Christmas. People will always be people, no matter what day of the year it is, and people cheat each other, rob each other, and kill each other, even on what's supposed to be the most peaceful day of the year. I think during my whole career in homicide, I got called out to a scene on Christmas Day more than 50% of the time. I know the holiday is supposed to be about peace and, like I said, goodwill, but there's also something about that time of the year that brings out the very worst in people. I don't know if it's the alcohol, the cold, or the attempts to manufacture happiness, but for some folks, the cracks really begin to show around the holidays. Then, enough of those cracks and whole structures come crumbling down, sometimes with fatal consequences. That's what I figured happened with one case that I got back in the early 2000s. Me and my partner rolled up to this house on the North Shore. Nice place, 4 bedrooms, all decorated for the holidays. There was a woman lying in the driveway with 3 entry wounds around her neck and shoulders. Walking past her, and we could see the front door was open. In the hallway, her husband was lying on his back with a single entry wound under his chin, and his brains splattered all over the ceiling and floor behind him. Scattered all over the carpeted floor of the home's front rooms, which were so exquisitely decorated they could have been the cover of a Christmas card, were dozens of sheets of printed paper. We began to carefully collect, photograph, and analyze them, but I think we were maybe only a third of the way through before we figured out what had happened. The pieces of paper depicted screenshots of text message chains, email threads, and other assorted evidence of marital infidelity. The wife was having an affair. The husband found out about it, and he presented all the evidence to her on Christmas morning, all wrapped up in a big red and white bow. I guess she tried to run, but the husband had his piece ready, meaning she barely made it halfway up the driveway before he shot her to death. Then, once he realized what he'd done, he put the gun to his own chin and pulled the trigger. It seemed like a pretty simple case, triggered by a cheating spouse, but as we went through the motions of putting together our evidence file, we started to notice some frightening inconsistencies. First off, and this tends to be the case with most contemporary homicide investigations, we tried to locate the cell phones of the deceased and his victim. Unless a crime is entirely spontaneous, a perp's phone is usually a treasure trove of evidence, whether it's Googling how to dispose of a dead body or overtly threatening their eventual victim via text messages. It's always worth checking a person's phone for a malice afterthought. For obvious reasons, we also needed to corroborate the printouts with what was actually on the wife's phone, but it soon became evident that neither the husband nor the wife's cell phone were anywhere to be found. We considered the possibility that the husband had disposed or hidden of the phones in order to prevent his wife from calling for help. But even after turning the whole house upside down, we couldn't locate either of them. That's when we turned to local cell carriers for helping in triangulating the phones, and if anyone's wondering, this is how that works. Basically, in your area, there will be any number of cell phone towers, and whenever your phone is switched on, your phone talks back and forth with whatever tower is closest in order to receive data. These cell phone towers store all the data from these little digital conversations, but your phone doesn't talk to just one at a time. It'll talk to a bunch of them. This means that law enforcement, or whoever wants to find you, can not only pinpoint your rough location, but can use triangulation to determine your location within an accuracy of a few hundred yards. Even if you turn your phone off prior to committing a crime, we can use your last known location, sometimes as a focal point for the coming investigation. And not only do these pings allow us to determine a phone's rough location, but we also know what time it was at any given place prior to being switched off. And this is where we discovered the second inconsistency. We estimated the time of the couple's death to be between 6:30 and 7 in the morning. We had neighbors say that they heard what they thought were gunshots around that time, but figured it was simply someone test-firing something Santa had brought them. The 3 to 4 shots they heard weren't followed by any screams or sirens or anything, so they just went back to sleep, adding that this was around 6:45 a.m. In which case, both husband and wife expired by 7 a.m. or 7:15 at the latest. But if that was the case, why was the final ping from both their cell phones recorded just prior to 8 a.m.? Or, to put it in layman's terms, how did two dead people both turn their phones off after their own deaths? As you can imagine, this blew our investigation wide open, since it meant that a third party had to have been present at the scene of the crime. This happened from time to time. Someone walks in on something they shouldn't have, then is too scared to talk about it for whatever reason. But placing our third party at the scene right around the same time the two phones stopped talking with the cell towers, that suggested something that was as chilling as it was unusual. Then after this tragedy, someone stepped over their dead bodies, turned off their phones, then absconded with them for reasons unknown. At that point, we were expecting more twists to the tale, but we didn't have to wait long for them. At first, when it came to ballistics analysis, everything seemed to check out. The gun found in the husband's hand was definitely the same one used to shoot his wife and then himself. There was also powder residue on the guy's chin, as well as on the gun's muzzle, meaning it had been fired point blank at his chin. His fingerprints were on the trigger, as well as on the pistol's grip, but two things struck our ballistics experts as suspicious. The fingerprints on the grip were considerably fainter than those on the trigger, meaning there's no doubt that he pulled it, but if he did, it was with an unusually soft hold on the gun's grip. While it's not impossible to fire a gun like that, there's no way that he'd been able to shoot himself in that fashion without getting any gunshot residue over his shooting hand. And at that point, we officially had a homicide on our hands. It was a tiny, tiny slip-up, a detail that might have even gotten by a less professional investigation, but it didn't get by us, and like I said, it changed absolutely everything regarding our crime scene. In a way, choosing Christmas morning to commit a double murder displayed a twisted kind of genius. Commit the same murder in an urban apartment building, even on Christmas Day, I'll find you half a dozen witnesses by the end of the day. But kill two people at 6:45 on Christmas morning in the suburbs, and the best we had was a person who heard the shots. No one was awake to see or hear anything of real significance, and having left behind nothing in the way of forensic evidence, our killer was little more than a ghost. They even used the husband's own gun to really try and throw us off the scent, and although we were smart enough to figure out what we were looking at, we didn't have the luck required to be able to track our perpetrator. And don't get me wrong, we tried our absolute best to single out any suspicious vehicles entering or leaving the area, and we employed at least half a dozen other extensive investigative techniques to try and get an idea of who we were dealing with. But each time, we came back empty-handed, and the case eventually turned cold. Officially speaking, it's still an open investigation, and from what I've heard, it's been worked over by a couple of other detectives, each hoping to be the one to crack it. But just like ours, their efforts proved fruitless, and each time, it's been tossed back in the rest of the cold cases, waiting for some other ambitious young greenhorn to come along and get lost in it all over again. Now, from experience, contract killers are something homicide detectives rarely encounter. People kill each other for all kinds of reasons, but very rarely do they kill complete strangers for vast sums of untraceable cash. Frankly, I found myself more disturbed by those who killed relatives or spouses to collect insurance money. I can almost understand being able to pull the trigger on a stranger, but my kid or my wife, not for all the money in the world. That being said, seeing evidence of something that verges on an urban legend, it was chilling. Very chilling. It marked the one and only time I ever saw a sophisticated cover-up, one that worked just enough to have us looking in the wrong place, for just long enough for a killer to get away scot-free. It makes me wonder just how many other cases are the same way. someone goes missing or passes suddenly while they're alone or at risk or potentially maybe taking their own life. How many cases are labeled a tragic accident when in reality, they're anything but? Being an addict during the holidays can be a surreal experience, and that's putting it lightly. My first Christmas as a junkie was actually pretty awesome, if you can believe it. I was still a weekend warrior back then, limiting my doses to stave off physical addiction, and whenever I felt myself getting a little too into it, I'd wean myself off with Suboxone and then start all over again. But then, as time went by, the small amount I used to do wasn't enough, so just a little got to be more and more. Slowly but surely, it took over my hobbies, work, then eventually family, until the only important thing in the world was making sure that I had enough not to get dope sick. I managed to stay functioning for about a year, and by that I mean I managed to hold down a job, keep up with relationships, and otherwise refrain from being a total screw-up. But after a bad breakup with the one girl that was holding me together, I gave up on any kind of dream or aspiration I had and settled on taking H for the rest of my life instead. I guess that sounds like a pretty crappy decision when I lay it out like that, but that's essentially what I did. I told myself it was all just temporary, that my so-called hero's journey would end in me kicking H after a few months on my butt, and that it would all end up being a crazy story that I told my drinking buddies one day. Well, a few months turned into 6 years of lost time, and like I said, the first few holiday seasons weren't so bad. But once I stopped talking to my parents and moved up to Portland, that's when things started getting rough. For a start, a junkie in the Pacific Northwest, the year split into two halves. As the old Ella Fitzgerald song goes, summertime and the living is easy. And that's for all the obvious reasons you can imagine. Nice weather, good dope after the dry season harvest down in Mexico, and everyone's relatively chilled out. But then in winter, all you got is dope from the wet season harvest, which is weak crap that barely gets you high. Then on top of that, when it gets real icy or the snow is too thick, getting your hands on enough dope to see you through the day gets tougher and tougher. Then eventually around Christmas, pretty much everyone who isn't a degenerate junkie takes a 24 to 48 hour break to sing Feliz Navidad, see their families and eat their turkey or whatever. An experienced junkie knows to stock up before then, meaning people are boosting and selling like crazy in anticipation of their dealers turning their cell phones off for the day. So in the run-up to Christmas, I've been squirreling away cash like crazy, and on the 23rd, me and my girl managed to score 15 grams of crappy dope that'd be enough to see us through this next week or so, without having to go out into the ice and snow to score more. We scored in the early afternoon, went back to my apartment, did enough to stop getting sick, then I went off to work for a few hours. My girl had a job working as a waitress and started her shift like an hour or two after I did, so it was normal that I'd come home to an empty apartment. So I finished my shift. One of the guys from work gives me a ride back home, and I got these tingles of exhilaration knowing I'm about to spend an hour or two in a warm bath with a few bumps of H to keep me company. I walk into my apartment, flop down onto the couch, then reach under it to pull out the little wooden box that we'd kept our dope in, and I sat it down on the coffee table, flipped it open, but instead of the 5 little baggies that should have been staring at me, there was nothing. At the time, I figured there had to be some kind of mistake. I had all these wishful thoughts, like maybe my girl had stashed the dope elsewhere after she saw the cops hanging around our apartment building or something, or maybe she poured all the dope into one of the bigger baggies that we had. You'd honestly be amazed at how much people will pay for baggies when they really, really need them, so maybe she'd sold or swapped the smaller ones, then just forgotten to put the dope back in the box. It sounds really pathetic looking back on it, but it took me a really depressing long amount of time to realize that there wasn't some innocent explanation for $300 worth of dope going missing. My girl wasn't my girl anymore, and on her way out, she'd stolen almost everything of value that she could carry. Again, sounds pretty pathetic, but I think that was one of the single worst moments of my life right there. My immediate reaction was, well, bad, but with addiction comes a certain pragmatism. Every moment I wasted freaking out that the love of my life had betrayed me for a few bags of dope was one that I wasn't spending trying to recoup my losses. So I got to work. I walked for miles, literally miles, making almost constant phone calls to a bunch of different people. Now don't get it twisted, I was still trying to call my girl, but she continued ducking my calls, and in the end, it didn't make sense to jam up my line with calls to her voicemail, even if it did mean that I could leave her some threatening voicemails. I'm not proud of it, but it is what it is. Anyway, I call around every dealer I know, and everyone is either out of stuff or is finishing up for the night and not answering their phones. All out of options, I started calling around everyone I know that uses, and all I can get my hands on is enough dope to last me the night. I walk over to the place, get the stuff, and walk all the way back to my apartment. I'm still trying to get a hookup the whole way. When I get back, I wait until I'm feeling gross, then I fix, go to bed, and wake up bright and early the next day to start all over again. The next day, pretty much the same thing happened, only without the goddamn disaster at the start of it. I walked all over town, almost constantly on the phone, but all I could find was enough to fix me for that night and that night alone. Everywhere I went, I was asking if anyone had seen my girl, and when everyone said no, every single time, I had this overwhelming sensation that they were lying to me. I guess it was partly paranoia, but partly based in fact too, because she couldn't have just disappeared on her own like that. Someone knew where she was, and who she'd run off with. But even if they knew, they'd never tell me. No one wanted to have the blood on their hands, and given the headspace that I was in at the time, I honestly couldn't tell you what I'd have done if I'd gotten my hands on my thieving ex-girlfriend. Anyway, like I said, I did a lot of walking, and only managed to get a hold of about 0.5 gram. So despite having enough to keep me from going into withdrawals on Christmas Eve, I knew Christmas Day was going to be rough as all hell. But still, the poetry of it wasn't lost on me. Cold turkey on Christmas Day. No better day for it, right? The weird thing, though, is when you're on heroin or any kind of powerful opiate, it kind of makes you chemically incapable of caring. Ever wonder why street junkies seem to have zero shame when it comes to begging or shoplifting? We just don't care. At least after those first few times, if you're deep enough into it, it becomes just another thing. So, I knew I was screwed, but it wasn't going to hit me until I started to get sick, and when it did, it hit me all at once. Around 8:30 on Christmas morning, I started calling everyone I knew who used again. This was the 3rd day in a row, so people were only naturally starting to get sick of hearing from me. Everyone was either out or didn't have a single hit to spare me, and the more desperate I got, the more I turned to sketchier and sketchier sources. These were people who, for one reason or another, I'd learned not to associate or do business with, and in the case of one of them, I literally had him saved in my contacts as Sketchy Kevin. I worked my way through Sketchy Kevin, another guy I'd call Pissy Pete, and then finally a guy named Rat Tail, named so because he wore his hair in a rat tail like 10 years ago after it got lame to do so. He also partly earned the nickname due to being a complete and utter scumbag, but by noon on Christmas Day, I was relying on that scumbag to score me some dope. Rat Tail said that he'd see what he could do, and would call me back if anything came up. About an hour later, he did, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear. Rat Tail said that there was a dude named George who would just straight up give me a couple of grams, but he just needed a favor. Right away, I thought that was weird, because who the hell just gives away dope? But Rat Tail said that he wasn't a junkie, and he needed someone who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. I didn't like the sound of that, nor did I have any idea what Rat Tail meant. But I was also in no position to turn the offer down, so off I went after getting a hold of George's address. The last place I expected to end up that day was a nice-looking 3-story right on the edge of where the city meets the suburbs. It was way too nice of a place to have any heroin inside, but then again, appearances can be deceptive. I walked up the driveway, knocked on the door, and some totally normal-looking, well-to-do dentist-looking dude welcomes me inside like I'm some late dinner guest that he'd been expecting. It was to the point where, despite this dude expecting me, I sort of didn't believe that he had the dope to just give away, and I started thinking that he was like a cop or something. I don't know how that had worked out, but I honestly couldn't mentally handle the setup, so I just started asking questions. Where's this dude's family? Did he actually have the dope? Could I see it, and could I fix before I did whatever he wanted me to do? The guy had no problem showing me the dope, and he had no problem if I used a little, if it helped me get the job done. I was so desperate by then that whatever it was didn't matter. All that mattered was the dope. I took the baggie he gave me, went up to the bathroom and did my thing. All I did was smoke and snort, never got into needles, always hated them, so it was a relatively quick process of snorting some and then seeing what the deal was with the task that he wanted. And during that, George leads me onto the 3rd floor of the house and into what he said was the guest bedroom. And there, lying on the bed, was the body. The kid looked to be about high school age, and he was just laying on their back, wide-eyed, with all this dried puke around his mouth. I'll never forget what George said to me when I gave him this look of horror. He was 18, I swear. The poor kid's age was the very last thing on my mind in that moment. I had a ton of other questions, and George seemed more than happy to fill me in without me asking. I don't know what happened. One minute we were... then the next he... And that was all he said. Well, aside from the very last thing, which was, I need him gone. I'd rather not go into what happened next. I'm not proud of it, and to be perfectly honest, it's extremely incriminating. I don't imagine George was really George, and I don't know how in the hell he knew a guy like Rat Tail, but the only thing that keeps my conscience clean is thinking that at least he didn't kill him. If it was just a tragic accident that happened, I don't know, somehow, then all I did was help clean it up. At least that's what I told myself at the time. And now I'm not so capable of lying to myself that easily. I don't know if the poor kid was ever found, but if he was, it was never linked back to me. Maybe that George character, but never directly to me. And so, that's the story of the worst Christmas I ever had, where I hid a dead body for some varnished old psycho just to get enough heroin to see me through the holidays. Worst thing is, I didn't even quit for like another year. Not truly, that is. But that was definitely the event that made me realize that I truly hit rock bottom. Getting clean was rough too, especially rough. I wanted so badly to put things right, but not only was I so high at the time that I'm not sure I could remember exactly where I put all the pieces, but I was far too cowardly to face up to all the terrible things I'd done during my years as a junkie. I guess this works as a sort of confession too, but I think it reads much better as a warning, and not even specifically regarding heroin either. No matter what you do in life, don't ever sell your soul for anything. And by that I mean, nothing is worth selling your conscience or your innocence for, because they're not things that you can never get back once they're gone. And my second warning is that ghosts are very, very real. They're not real in the sense that you might expect, but if you do something terrible enough to someone innocent enough, you can bet your bottom dollar they'll haunt you for the rest of your life. Just like that poor naked teenager with puke around his mouth still haunts me. Every single Christmas. In my final year of primary school, which is 5th grade to all you Americans reading, we had this new kid join called Linford. I obviously can't talk for anyone else's school, but I imagine it's roughly the same all over. a new kid joins your school and is a bit standoffish and shy at first for obvious reasons. But after a few days of assimilating, they're either adopted by an individual or inducted into a pre-existing friend group. But that wasn't the case with Linford. Right away, kids began to say that Linford smelled. It was confirmed by anyone who sat next to him in class or in assembly or at dinner time. He didn't stink. It wasn't unbearable or anything like that, but I remember smelling him myself at one point and just feeling sorry for him. I was only 10, but I was old enough to know that if this kid smelled, there was definitely something wrong with his home life. I think a lot of kids probably felt the same way, but no one wanted to approach him for fear of being labeled the smelly kid's friend. Then finally, when someone did finally approach Linford, they soon regretted it. I remember there being a big fight one day on the school playground and all the kids ran over to watch. I was no different, but when I look at the two who were fighting, I saw that it wasn't so much a fight as it was a battering. Linford was smacking the smaller kid around the head while the kid tried desperately to shield himself. Teachers rushed over, wading through the sea of screaming kids to break this fight up. And Linford got suspended for the rest of the week while his victim only went home for the rest of the day. We had to wait a day to find out how the fight had started, but when we did, it was pretty shocking. Apparently all the kid did was walk over to Linford and ask if he wanted to come and play football with him and some friends. And that was it. Nothing was said in return. Linford just launched into the attack and started smacking the kid about. This was pretty terrifying, to be honest. Even at that age, we kind of knew that Linford was a bit of a psycho, if that's how he reacted to a friendly invitation. And when he returned to school at the start of the following week, everyone avoided him like the plague. That phase was even more depressing than the period after he first appeared. He'd obviously got a talking to from his parents and the head teacher, most likely encouraging him to make more of an effort to make friends. But by that stage, that ship had well and truly sailed. Everyone was terrified of him, so any attempts to ingratiate himself were almost instantly rebuffed. I remember kids saying things like, "He's nice now, but how long until he snaps and lashes out again?" And so that was that. Linford remained friendless, despite any attempt that he made to change that, and as time went on, those attempts got much, much more bizarre and much darker. And it all culminated in Linford bringing a gerbil to school in an empty plastic rice pot. I'll never forget that. It was a pilau rice pot with all the different colored grains, but it was a pot that Linford had forgotten to equip with air holes. Obviously, the gerbil didn't survive the journey into school, but that didn't seem to bother Linford at all. He got caught playing with the poor thing's lifeless, suffocated body, and that was the end of Linford. I don't know where he went. If he went to some kind of behavioral school or something, but I most certainly didn't think that I'd ever see him again. So cut to the middle of year 11, which is 10th grade in American years, but the last compulsory year that we have to actually do in the UK. Seeing as it's the last year, we got to do exams, so obviously year 11 is quite an important one. Then in mid-October, I think it was, we had a new kid appear in our year group, presumably having moved from another school so he could do his exams at ours instead of wherever he was before. This is obviously a different school than the one I met Linford at, and although a lot of us ended up going to the same primary and secondary, it wasn't all the same people. That meant that when I had heard the news of the new kid, that was all I heard. I didn't realize who it was until I actually laid eyes on him. It was Linford, a 16-year-old version of the psycho that had played with a dead gerbil on his desk during a lunch break. And he'd grown up to be, as my little nephew says, an absolute unit. As you can imagine, news of who the new kid was swept through our school like wildfire, and just like it had all those years ago, rumors of what he was like had everyone either straight up avoiding him or walking on eggshells whenever he was around. He was scary back then, but now he was somewhere around 5'10" and easily 15 stone to boot. I know I kept talking about how sad it all is, but I really do feel like the need to touch on it again. Linford had clearly never made any friends in the time that he'd been elsewhere, and while we'd all developed into charismatic young people, right on the cusp of adulthood, Linford seemed like the same weird loner he appeared to be in primary school. But then, just like the first time he joined our school, Any sympathy people had for him quickly evaporated when he started acting like a total jerk to everyone. So in the last 2 years of secondary school, I was having this will they, won't they kind of flirtation with a girl called Laura. We ended up getting together for a while after we left school, but while we were there, I think we were just too embarrassed to admit that we fancied each other, so we insisted that we were just friends while hanging out with each other almost non-stop. Anyway, one day, Laura comes up to me during lunch and tells me that she's got a bit of a problem. Linford had followed her home on the previous night, then stood outside her house until her dad went outside to shoo him away. I remember the sense of dread building as she talked because I could see what she was about to ask me from a mile away. She wanted me to approach Linford and tell him to stop following her home. Now, I'll be honest, Linford did scare me, but that fear was somehow overridden by whatever nascent puppy love I was feeling for Laura. So possibly against my best interests, I told her that I'd have a word with him. Then, at the end of the day, when it came time for Laura to walk herself home, I decided to walk with her. It was a bit of a detour from my own route home, but like I said, it seemed well worth it to prove what a good friend I was, aka boyfriend. We started on the walk, then what do you know? Linford suddenly appeared behind us, unmistakable with his jet black hair and telltale squint. Linford apparently needed glasses, but he never wore them. The moment I saw him, I stopped, told Laura to wait ahead of us, then walked back to confront Linford. I asked him if he was following Laura home, but he didn't even so much as look at me. All he did was sort of smirk a bit and then try to walk past me. In response, I walked with him, ready to sigh, telling him, I don't think Laura wants you to be following her home, mate. You should stop. Again, he just ignores me, but I can tell he's getting worked up, so I took a few steps away from him as I asked him once again if he thought following a girl home was maybe a bit of a bad idea. He didn't respond, not right away, and I was about to launch into another little plea to stop following us when, out of nowhere, he swung a punch at me and missed. I know it sounds a bit daft looking back on it, but I remember asking him, Whoa, what's your bloody problem? His eyes went all wide, and he pointed a finger at me, then screamed, You're my sodding problem. I thought he was going to launch himself at me there and then, but he didn't. Instead, he turned his back, then walked off in the direction he'd come from. Bearing in mind that this was my first actual interaction with Linford. We'd never, ever spoken before, not even in primary school for any reason, but then the way he spoke to me, it was like we'd been arch rivals for years or something. I suppose that looking back on it with hindsight, he resented me for being so close to Laura. So while I thought of him as nothing more than the lad who was a bit weird and sad, he'd been developing this full-on hatred for me for weeks on end. Thankfully, he stopped trying to follow Laura home after that, but instead, he turned his attentions to me. Linford gave me death stares whenever he and I crossed paths, and I'll be honest, it definitely had me a bit worried. He used to openly read this book about serial killers, which the teachers never did anything about because I suppose that technically, reading meant that he was educating himself and they probably didn't want to discourage it. But then that made me and everyone I hung around with think that Linford might actually pull some serial killer level crap and axe me to death in the corridors one day. I mean, we were sort of half joking about it, but the other half was legitimately concerned. And when the Christmas holidays rolled around, I was only too happy to have a break from the daily death stares. But then, the day school ended, Linford tried following me home instead. I should have just tried to punch him. Anything to stop him from following me, but I'm just not that type of person. I wasn't some hard case back then, and I'm not some hard case now either, so the idea of me trying to box this lad who was way taller and wider than me is just laughable. Luckily, Linford didn't seem to want to fight either, but at the same time, there was nothing I could do about him following me. He kept his distance, but obviously wanted me to know that he was following me because he wasn't exactly trying to hide it or anything. I tried losing him by walking in a circle around the local park, but no matter what I did, be it run across a field or suddenly change direction, he managed to get wind of where I'd gone and follow me. By the time I got to my house, I actually thought that I'd managed to lose him, but when I looked over my shoulder to check one last time before I walked through my front door, there he was. I felt sick, not because he outsmarted me, or because he displayed a sort of Michael Myers-level dedication to tracking my movements, but because I felt like it put my family at risk. I almost started to regret sticking up for Laura the way that I did. Because we knew her dad could handle the situation. He was a big, scary-looking builder, whereas my dad was much more like me. Not a fighter by any stretch, and definitely no match for a now 16-year-old Linford. I remember keeping it to myself, which was unbelievably foolish in retrospect. Firstly, I thought that I'd end up on punishment for making trouble at school than bringing it home. Secondly, I knew that mentioning Linford to my parents would have a dark cloud hanging over us for the whole Christmas holidays. I was horribly anxious, but as the days went by and we got closer and closer to Christmas without incident, I started to think that Linford might just leave me alone. Turns out, I was right. Linford wasn't actually planning to do anything to me or my family, but the same couldn't be said for Laura. On Christmas Eve, so the 23rd of December, I remember I stayed in bed much later than I usually would, then woke up to a load of missed calls on my phone, each of them from Laura. I called her back right away, assuming that it had to be some kind of emergency, and my biggest fear was that it was something to do with Linford. And again, I just so happened to be right. She missed my first few calls, but called me back quite quickly, then basically said, "I hope you're sitting comfortably because I got a story for you." You see, the previous night, everyone in Laura's house had been in bed when her dad was woken up by a noise coming from downstairs. Laura's house at the time was tall and skinny, so TV and dining rooms on the bottom floor, parents' room and bathroom on the first, then the two kids' rooms on the very top floor. Laura said that she didn't hear anything until much later, but her parents did, and when they woke up, they heard something coming from the backyard. Laura's dad looks out the back window and there's a person, dressed in all dark clothing, carrying a rucksack, and he's trying to quite literally push their back patio doors in. Lauren's dad armed himself with a baseball bat that he kept under their bed, while her mom called the police, and together, they watched this dark figure trying and failing over and over to push through their patio doors. I suppose it was an attempt to gain entry to the house as silently as possible, and having seen those patio doors myself, I know they open both outward and inward. My point is, there was a real possibility that if someone had neglected to lock the door up tight, the person might have been able to gain access to the house in almost complete silence. Anyway, since it was a crime in progress, as they say, the police whizzed around pretty quickly, snuck around the back, then rugby tackled the would-be intruder. And at that, Laura's dad runs downstairs to give them a hand, but Laura said that all he kept saying was, "Let me get a look at him, let me get a look at him." Burglars are depressingly common around this time of year, with all the manner of expensive Christmas presents just sitting there under various trees. I think that was probably everyone's first thought. But then it must have hit Laura's dad before it hit her, because it was only when he said, "Let me take a look at him," that she realized who it might have been, or rather, who it actually was. She said that she got chills the moment her dad said, "Yeah, that's him. He was here a few weeks ago after he followed my daughter home." It was Linford. Now, the fact that he tried to break into her house in the middle of the night was frightening enough, but that was nothing on what Linford had in his backpack. The police found all sorts of pills, rope, knives, tools, a load of cheap headphones, and a cassette tape. The police told Laura's dad they tried playing the tape, but all that was on it was a weird kind of discordant music. Linford wouldn't explain what he was planning on doing. I know he was arrested, but he ended up getting charged with a load of different things, and I don't think I can remember them all off the top of my head. I know he got charged with attempted breaking and entering, but then there were other charges involving conspiracy to do all sorts of different things. I think kidnap was one, GBH was another, but then there was odds and sods in there too on account of all the crap that he had in his rucksack, something like conspiracy to administer poisons, something like that anyway. But regardless, Linford ended up doing a disappearing act for the second time, much to our relief. And if he managed to sit his exams, it definitely wasn't in our school. I sometimes wonder if he ended up going to kiddie prison, and for how long, because if it were up to me, he'd be in some kind of loony bin to get some proper treatment. He was so obviously a wrong'un from the start that it just makes sense to think that there was either something wrong with him, or he came from some uber messed up household with God knows what kind of parents there to mess him up. Either way, if he got locked up, I hope he got some actual treatment for whatever was wrong with him, instead of just getting worse and worse until I end up seeing him on the front page of a newspaper over something truly terrible that he's done. The weirdest thing is, though, I sometimes think that thing might involve me. He'd already shown up twice before in my life. Why not a third? And if he's gotten worse and worse with age, what will he be like if I suddenly run into him in a dark alley one night? I suppose I might never know the answers to those questions. But what I do know is that if I ever run into Linford, I'll run a mile the other way just to avoid him. During the early summer of 2006, I ended up getting a 6-month prison sentence for credit card fraud. The ins and outs of it are sort of embarrassing, plus they aren't particularly interesting either. I was a greedy idiot who thought that he was smarter than everyone else, and then the Fed proved me wrong. Then, instead of trying to play it off like it was all just an innocent mistake, which at that stage would have risked getting me 3 to 4 years, I decided to take a plea deal. I had to sit down with 2 federal agents, explain exactly what I'd done and how I'd done it. Then, after officially entering a plea of guilty, I got 6 months. My release date ended up being December 24th of 2006, and like every other prisoner with a short sentence, I was counting the days until my release. I had guys telling me not to do that, that I should just focus on keeping myself busy and that the days would take care of themselves. I was also housed with other non-violent prisoners, so although there was friction and the occasional fight between inmates, we didn't have to worry about all that stuff that goes on with the gangbangers and lifers that were housed in other tiers. I thought everyone around me was just a screw-up like I was, that there were no murderers, perverts, or other kind of psychopaths. But as I came to discover, that wasn't completely true. My cellmate was an okay dude, but we weren't close, so whenever we had any free time, I used to hang out with this group of 3 other guys. We'd just play cards and dominoes, chess or checkers, whatever we could get our hands on, and from time to time, we'd be joined by this guy that they called Spike. He looked to be in his late 30s, receding hairline, bright blue eyes, kind of a baby face considering how old he really was. He could have easily passed for a very stressed college senior, and he had the intelligence to match. When it came to chess and poker, Spike was the one you wanted to beat. I guess he'd had years to practice, but he was just on another level when it came to a thinking man's game. We'd all be talking crap to each other, and Spike would just stay quiet, thinking things over until it came to making his move. I always assumed that he was in for some high-level financial stuff, that he'd probably scanned some hedge fund out of millions before he finally slipped up or something, but I also never cared to ask him for what exactly he was in for. I can't speak for other prisons, or even other tiers of the one I did my time in, but generally speaking, you didn't ask what someone was in for when it came to non-violent crimes. If a guy was in for doing something to kids, they were generally kept sequestered from other prisoners, especially the violent ones. So on the whole, you just have an idea of what a guy is in for, and you let sleeping dogs lie, as they say. But anyway, I do my 6 months, and on release day, I'm going around saying goodbye to all the guys that I got in tight with and giving most of my stuff away. I get around most people, and then it comes to saying goodbye to Spike. As usual, he didn't say all that much, but just like pretty much everyone else I talked to, they asked if I had plans for the holidays. I gave everyone the same reply and told him that I was planning on spending the holidays up at my parents', a place up in Vegas. I've been looking forward to it for months, and it seemed like the perfect antidote to spending 6 months inside. When they first got the news that I was headed to prison, they were a mix of furious and heartbroken. There was talk of cutting me off, and how I was quote-unquote killing my mother. But over time, their anger faded. All they wanted was for me to come home, and frankly, that's all I wanted too. I didn't share all of that with Spike, but I think he got the gist of how I was feeling regarding my status as the all-prodigal son. Most other guys had simply shaken my hand and said something to the effect of, "Have a good one. Don't let me see you back here." But Spike actually took the time to give me some poetic advice. He told me to cherish every second I could with my nearest and dearest, because God knows you miss them when they're gone. It was advice that I took right there on the spot to my heart, and as the CO walked me out of the tier later, I caught Spike's eye, and he reminded me of the advice that he'd given me. He didn't say what it was, not out loud, but we both knew. Now, about a minute later, the CO leading me to the departures, that's literally what they're called, just like an airport, asked me, "Do you know who that guy is?" I told him, sure I did. That was Spike. But then the CO asked me if I knew who he really was. For the first time in the whole time that I was locked up, it actually occurred to me that, no, I didn't really know any of the guys that I'd shared a tier with. I mean, sure, I knew their day-to-day. I knew their individual personalities, but I didn't know all that much about their past or the specific details of the crimes they committed. I remember the distinct feeling of dread I felt as I asked him who Spike really was. And this is literally right as the CO is dropping me off at departures for processing. "Mitchell Overhand," he told me. "Go look him up." The first chance I got, I Googled Mitchell Overhand, and what I found had my jaw on the floor. You see, back in 1989, a 15-year-old Mitchell, or Spike as I'd come to know him, had a falling out with his mom and dad. I don't know what it was over, but from what I read, the relationship between them had been strained for quite some time. And then one day, Mitchell walks into the kitchen, or TV room, or whatever his mom and dad were sitting in, and shot them both at point-blank range. He took his dad out right away, maybe with a head or heart shot, I don't know for sure, but his mom was still alive. Then, either because he was out of bullets or because he felt like it, Mitchell took a claw hammer from his dad's toolkit, then bashed his mom's head in with it to finish her off. When he was done, he dragged their bodies into a shallow grave that he dug in a backyard flower bed, covered them over, and cleaned up the house, then threw a party for himself and his friends. To know the guy, you never would have guessed in a million years that he committed a crime like that. He was quiet, introspective, never did anything without thinking about it a whole bunch first. I guess that's what made him so good at poker, and I also guess it's a lesson that he learned the hard way. I also assumed that he'd moved in with the non-violent prisoners after it became obvious that he wasn't violent by nature. He must have done a few years in juvie before being transferred to an adult prison, and when he arrived, they must have figured, hey, seems non-violent to us. Let's house him appropriately. I never spoke to Spike again. I never talked to any of the guys I did time with actually, but as you can probably tell, I still think about them from time to time. More than time to time, actually. I think Spike made a terrible mistake in a fit of rage and spent the rest of his years regretting it. I'm not saying he didn't deserve to be locked up for it. I mean, at the time I can understand why people would brand him as a monster, then lock him up and throw away the key. But the man I met was not the same boy who killed his parents on a whim, and it made the advice that he gave me about cherishing my time with them and how I'll miss them when they're gone all the more haunting. Whenever I sleep outside of my normal bedroom, you know, like in a hotel somewhere like that, I hear this strange sound. It almost sounds like someone sighing or exhaling. It's somewhere in the room, but I can never find out where it's coming from. It sounds like there is someone else sleeping in the room with me. I can hear this noise if the lights are on and still cannot find the source of the noise. It's just really strange. I have tried taking photos and videos with my smartphone, but when I play them back, I get nothing. I turn the lights off, squint, and wait for my eyes to become adjusted to the darkness, and sometimes I feel like there is something amidst the darkness. I can't be sure, though. It feels like there is something in the room with me now and then, some shape in the dark, and the feeling is quite creepy. I get worried whenever I hear that sighing, that exhaling noise, and it becomes impossible to ignore it. I first noticed it last September, and once I heard it, there was no way to unhear it. I travel a lot for work, and my company seems to have this wonderful skill where they're able to locate the cheapest and most out-of-the-way hotels that money can buy. I guess maybe sleeping in all these rundown motels and hotels could have created this nervousness, and maybe I am imagining things. Well, that was what I thought, until the other night. I heard the same sound at home, the one place that I hadn't heard it before. It happened when I came home late from work. I remember I bought pasta that night, and I was eating it at the kitchen table. My whole family was sleeping. My eyes were really dry, so I reached for the eye drops and put a drop in each eye, and I'm still sat at the kitchen table at this point. I then heard that strange sighing sound. I wanted to open my eyes, but since I had just put the drops in them, I couldn't open them straight away. So I slowly opened my right eye, only a little bit, and I looked around the kitchen, and of course, like always, there was nothing there. It was new. Like I said, I had only heard it when I was away from my home, but that night I heard it in my home. Now I was annoyed. I wanted some answers. I wasn't in a hotel. I was at home, so I could investigate as much as I'd like, and that's what I did. I looked around the kitchen, but the sound wasn't coming from there. Maybe it was coming from the hallway. No. Over towards the back door, perhaps. No. I couldn't find it. I was really straining my ears while I was searching. I felt like the sound was definitely in the kitchen. I left the room and walked back in to reset or get fresh ears. Is that even a phrase? I don't know. As soon as I re-entered the kitchen, I heard the sound, and it sounded like it was coming from somewhere close to the refrigerator. The thought that it was just a mechanical noise and I had too many late nights crossed my mind until I heard the sound mixed in with the dull hum of the refrigerator. It's here. I know it's around here, I thought as I bent over searching. The sound was louder for the first time, and it felt like I was actually getting closer. And with that in mind, I decided to hit the lights to see if it made a difference. Usually, I need some time to allow my eyes to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I feel like I can almost see something. But that night, something was different. My left eye. I could see very clearly from that eye in the dark. I guess it was because I kept my left eye shut while I was searching around the kitchen, and this was interesting. My vision seemed to improve more with my right eye shut too. After a few moments, I saw two white dots emerge out of the darkness. I quickly realized that these were the whites of someone's eyes. Then I could see that the pupils of those eyes were dark, almost black. These eyes in the darkness were looking directly at me. I gasped in shock. I had never seen anything like that before. I kept looking. I couldn't stop, and to my surprise, I could see the figure of someone, the owner of those eyes. It looked as if though they were tied up. Their limbs were clearly bound. The mouth wasn't really visible. I realized why. There was tape over their mouth. The sound that I was hearing was the inhalation and exhalation through their nose. And I could sense that there was no panic in this person. There was just some aura of hopeless acceptance. They were not fighting against their situation. And the atmosphere in the darkness of my kitchen was that of pure desolation and surrender. The steady, patient exhales and inhales continued, and I could only watch in stunned horror. I couldn't move. After a few moments, I couldn't tell you how many, the figure of the bound person appeared to become blurry, and then it faded into the darkness. To this day, I have no idea why this person, or perhaps should I say apparition, appeared to me. I haven't heard the breathing again in my home, and I really wish I knew more about that poor soul, and I wonder if I'll ever hear it again. Next week, I'll be going on another business trip, and I will do the same things that I did last time in an attempt to see the bound person again. I'll use my eye drops and get accustomed to the dark. Perhaps I will see them again. I'm not sure. I am both excited and terrified. This happened before a national holiday not too long ago. I didn't have school the next day, and that's always a cause for celebration, but I was up kind of late for my age, as it was about 10:30. I was in high school back then, and I will just have to quickly explain my family dynamic because it'll make sense later. My father passed away when I was younger. My mom works all the time, and I live with my grandparents. That night my granddad was out, and my grandma was downstairs somewhere. I was studying for exams, high-pressure stuff that I was supposed to care about massively for some reason. I was more interested in my music back then, to be honest. And I used to listen to my tunes through the PSP. I was taking a break from studying, just giving my eyes a rest, so I set my PSP down and I leaned back on my chair and shut my eyes for a second. I opened them and then looked at my bedroom door. I noticed something, and it sent my head into a spin. I saw something weird. It was like the figure of a person who wasn't a family member. It was just this shadowy shape peering at me around the door of the room across the hall. Across the hall was an empty room, and there was no logical reason why that shadow should be cast in that room. I first thought that my mom or grandma had left the window open to air out the house, and I was seeing a very human-looking curtain position, or said curtain being caught on the balcony or something. It seemed highly implausible, especially since the way it seemed to be leering around the door to look at me. It was no trick of the light. I watched that shadow then emerge from the spare room and enter the hallway. It was like it was fixated on me, and even though it was dark, I could tell by the movements of that thing that it was facing me. It crept around the door in the hallway with its back against the door and the hallway wall. I then watched it as it slowly backed off towards the stairs, and before I could see it descend the stairs, it disappeared. And here's the weird thing. It looked like it was the same height as me, and by its silhouette, it looked like it had the same hair and clothes that I had. It's really hard to explain. Now, like I said, it was just my grandma and I in that house at the time. She didn't go upstairs much because she had bad hips. But if it was her, I would recognize her silhouette, and surely she would hit a light or something. I was left there in my chair, shuddering, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. What does it mean? Something that kind of looked like me was watching me from the other room. And why and for what purpose? Was this some kind of spirit or shadow person? Did it leave because I spotted it? What would have happened if I didn't notice its presence? I was just horrified. When my brain searched and searched for logical answers and came back with none, it was just as terrifying. I started to freak out a bit, and then I thought, what if it comes back? I didn't want to go downstairs because that was the last place that I saw that thing head off to. I still have no idea what the hell that was, and I lived in that house right up until I moved out and feared that I would see that shadowy figure again, but thankfully I didn't. I did wonder if it could have been a home intruder. Maybe, I guess. I was young. Maybe I didn't know. But I don't know, though. I think I would have seen some features of that invader or their clothes, and I don't think it was that. I never told anyone in my family about what happened that night because I was worried that they would just laugh at me and call me weak. I didn't want my mom to worry about me when she was out working so many hours, and I do wonder if they would have believed me sometimes.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I found a single strand of hair tied around the doorknob of my front door. It was a long, dark piece, almost identical to my own, but not quite. The hair was knotted tightly around the knob, its end frayed as if it had been pulled with force. I stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of how it had gotten there. I hadn't noticed it earlier in the day, and I was sure I hadn't put it there. I had come home from work, checked my mail, and gone inside without noticing anything unusual. But now this strand of hair was there, as though someone had deliberately left it for me to find. I reached out to touch it, but a sudden chill ran through me, and I hesitated. My fingers hovered just above it, the cold evening air making me shiver. My mind raced with possibilities, none of which seemed comforting. Was someone inside? Had someone been in my apartment? The idea of an intruder made my heart beat faster, and I quickly checked the lock, making sure it was secure. I twisted the doorknob and the door opened, but everything seemed undisturbed inside. The lights were off, the furniture where it should be, nothing out of place. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling the weight of the air pressing around me. It felt different, heavier, as if something was lurking just beyond my awareness. But there was nothing obvious, nothing that stood out. I closed the door behind me, locking it with the same sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The hair was still on the doorknob, hanging there like an omen, something I couldn't ignore. I checked all the windows, the other doors, but nothing seemed disturbed. I had been careful about securing everything, but now my mind was filled with the idea that someone had been in my space. It wasn't just the hair, it was the way it was tied, the deliberate knotting around the knob as if to catch my attention. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was something left behind by a delivery person or a neighbor who had walked past. But as I turned to walk away, something caught my eye, a second strand of hair. It wasn't on the doorknob, but it was lying on the floor just inside the door, twisted in a loose spiral. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a simple mistake. I bent down to pick it up, my mind whirling with confusion. Was it another prank? But it felt wrong, like it had been placed there with a purpose. The hair was softer than I had expected, almost fragile in my hand. It was the same dark color, the same length, but there was something different about it, something I couldn't quite place. I didn't know what to think anymore, but the feeling of being watched crept over me again. I felt it in the back of my neck, the hair standing on end, my pulse quickening. I decided to lock up again, making sure everything was in place. But as I went to walk away from the door, I heard something, a faint sound from the other side. It wasn't loud enough to be footsteps, but it was something, a slight tapping or scratching, almost imperceptible. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and I stood in the silence, waiting. My heart was in my throat, and the air seemed thicker, heavier. Was someone out there, or was I just imagining it? I stood there, motionless, until I couldn't stand it anymore. I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I hesitated before pulling it open, just a crack, peering through the small gap. But there was nothing. No one. Just the empty hallway outside. The feeling of dread didn't leave, though. It lingered like a presence, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I stepped back, letting the door close behind me. I locked it again, triple-checking the bolts and chain, then turned to face the living room. It felt like something was wrong, like I wasn't alone even though I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was watching me from the shadows. I decided to distract myself. I turned on the TV, picked up my phone, anything to occupy my mind and push the fear away. But even as I tried to settle into the comfort of the evening, my eyes kept drifting to the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing, something that didn't belong. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a prank or a random occurrence, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. As I sat there, trying to ignore the growing anxiety in my chest, I heard the sound again. This time it was clearer, closer, as if it was coming from inside the apartment. A scratching noise, light but deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. I stood up abruptly, my pulse racing again, my eyes scanning the room. I checked every corner, the kitchen, the bathroom, but everything was silent. The scratching continued. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the door. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, to face the entrance. The air seemed to thicken with tension. I walked toward it cautiously, afraid to open the door again, afraid of what might be waiting for me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I reached for the doorknob. But as my hand closed around the knob, I froze. There, tied around the doorknob again, was another strand of hair. This time the hair was different. It was shorter, thinner, and there were more strands than before, wrapped tightly, woven together, as if someone had been waiting for me to find them. And as I stood there staring at it, I realized something. I wasn't alone. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. And I had no idea who they were or how they were getting in. But I was certain of one thing. This was just the beginning. Story 2. My bank statement included a withdrawal I never made from a branch in another state. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of error, a glitch in the system. I checked the details. The amount was significant, and the withdrawal had been made 2 days ago, at a branch I had never even heard of. I hadn't been out of state in months, let alone visited that specific branch. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach. Something was wrong. I immediately called my bank, my heart racing as the phone rang. When a representative answered, I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady. She seemed surprised, pulling up my account details. "There is no mistake," she said after a moment. "The withdrawal was made in person, at the location you mentioned." I could hear her typing, probably looking for more details, but nothing she said made me feel any better. "We'll investigate the matter, but it might take some time," she added. "In the meantime, your account will be flagged, and we'll send you a new card." I hung up, trying to calm myself down, but my mind kept racing. How could someone have gotten access to my account? The thought of someone standing at a bank counter in another state, using my information, made my skin crawl. I had to know how this happened, and I needed to find out who had done it. The next morning, I tried to think of any possible ways my information could have been compromised. I always checked my statements. I rarely used my card in public, and I hadn't shared my details with anyone. The idea that someone had somehow hacked my account was unsettling. I went online and started researching what I could do to protect myself, but nothing I read reassured me. It didn't explain how the withdrawal had occurred. That afternoon, I decided to contact the branch directly, hoping they might have security footage or some other clue. I called the number listed on the bank's website, but the person who answered was evasive, telling me that they couldn't share information about transactions over the phone. When I insisted, she told me I would have to file a formal request, which would take several business days. It was like they were hiding something, or they just didn't care. I felt a strange, growing sense of dread as I sat in my living room staring at the bank statement. The withdrawal had been made in person, the bank said. How had they managed to access my funds without a card or PIN? And who were they? I started looking through my recent activities, trying to find any clue, any trace that could lead me to an explanation. But the more I searched, the more the fear grew. I hadn't used my card anywhere recently that would have allowed someone to take my information. Days passed and I kept receiving updates from the bank. They had no answers. The withdrawal was still marked as valid, and no one could tell me how it had happened. The new card arrived in the mail, but it didn't help ease the tension. I felt trapped, like my privacy had been invaded in a way I couldn't undo. There was no sign of who had done it, no indication of how they'd gained access to my account, and it seemed like no one was taking it seriously. It wasn't until a week later, when I received a letter from the bank, that things took a more sinister turn. The letter was brief, stating that the investigation was still ongoing, but there was a new note. The branch in question has no records of the transaction matching your details. I reread that sentence several times, feeling a cold shiver run through me. If the transaction wasn't logged at the branch, then how could it have been made? It was like the withdrawal never happened, at least not in the way the bank was saying. A wave of unease washed over me as I realized that the more I dug into the situation, the less certain I became. The bank was telling me one thing, but the transaction seemed to defy any logical explanation. If it wasn't made at the branch, where did the money go? What if the transaction was being covered up, or worse? What if I was being targeted by someone with far more control over my life than I realized? The worst part was the feeling that this wasn't just about money. It was like the transaction was some sort of message, a warning. Whoever had done this knew where I lived, knew how to access my funds, and was leaving me with nothing but questions and a growing fear. I kept looking over the bank statement, over and over, each time hoping for a different answer, some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of the situation. But no matter how much I stared at the numbers, the realization settled deeper into my bones. I wasn't just a victim of identity theft. I was being watched. Story 3. I had just returned from my usual trip to the grocery store, bags in hand, ready to put away the few things I needed. As I unloaded the items, my eyes landed on the receipt nestled at the bottom of the bag. I always keep receipts for tracking expenses, so I reached for it, intending to add it to my collection. But when I glanced at the timestamp, something felt off. The receipt showed a timestamp of 3 p.m. I checked my watch, it was barely 5 p.m. I froze, staring at the numbers printed in front of me. 2 hours before I had even walked into the store. My heart began to race as I examined the receipt again, convinced there had to be some mistake. Maybe it was a glitch with the register or some sort of error with the time zone settings, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I replayed the events of the day in my head. I had left my house around 4:30 p.m., made the usual drive to the store, and hadn't been there longer than 30 minutes. There was no way I had shopped at 3 p.m., let alone bought these exact items. I had just picked up a few groceries, milk, eggs, bread, and some fruit, nothing out of the ordinary. But the timestamp said otherwise. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. It was 5:05 p.m. Now I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. I called the store, trying to get some clarity, but the clerk I spoke with just confirmed that the receipt had come from their register. They didn't have an explanation for the discrepancy. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. How could this receipt be time-stamped for 2 hours before I even went shopping? I hadn't bought anything earlier, I hadn't been at that store, and there was no way it could have been a mistake on my part. The whole situation made my skin crawl. I checked the receipt again, making sure it hadn't been swapped by mistake with another shopper's. but it clearly showed my name, my usual rewards number, and the specific items I'd picked up. I began to wonder if someone had been in the store before me, buying these items in my place. But no one had been with me, and I had checked out myself. No one else had touched my groceries. No one else had paid for them. That night I didn't sleep. The receipt haunted me, taunting me with its timestamp. I kept wondering if it was a sign, some kind of warning or clue. But to what? I thought about returning to the store the next day, asking if anyone had noticed anything strange, but I knew that would sound ridiculous. There was no explanation that would make sense, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was chasing shadows. The following day, I went back to the store to see if the same strange timestamp appeared on another receipt. But when I checked out, the time was completely normal, no odd discrepancies. The receipt was timestamped at the exact moment I made my purchase, just as it should have been. I left the store feeling more unsettled than ever, as if the previous day's events had somehow been a figment of my imagination. But then I checked the receipt again, the one from the day before, and I noticed something new, a faint smudge along the edge, almost like it had been handled recently. I hadn't noticed it before. The more I stared at it, the more it felt like it was beckoning me, like I had missed something critical. I still don't know what happened that day or how that receipt ended up in my bag, time-stamped for 2 hours before I went shopping. The store couldn't offer an explanation, and no one else seemed to think it was strange. But every time I look at that receipt, I feel the same tightness in my chest, the same nagging sense that something is wrong, something I can't explain, something that shouldn't have happened. Story 4. I had just settled into bed, the quiet of the night surrounding me, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it, half expecting a work-related message, or maybe a reminder about something I'd forgotten. Instead, I saw a text from an unknown number. My thumb hovered over the screen as I read the simple but chilling message, "I'm already inside." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just read. It didn't make any sense. I lived alone, and no one should have been inside my apartment, especially not without me hearing anything. I hadn't seen anyone come in. I hadn't even heard footsteps, but the text was clear: I'm already inside. I glanced around the room, my pulse quickening. The apartment was small, only a living room, kitchen, and a bedroom. It wasn't big enough for someone to hide without me noticing, and yet, the words still sent a wave of panic crashing over me. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I checked the locks on my bedroom door, though I already knew they were secure. But it was like the message had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, one I couldn't shake. I debated calling the police, but what could I tell them? That someone had sent me a vague text, and now I felt unsafe in my own home. They'd think I was overreacting. And yet, the sense of dread that had washed over me wasn't something I could ignore. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed, my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Had someone broken in? Was it some sick prank? The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I crept through the living room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, trying to spot any sign of someone hiding. The lights in the apartment were dim, the only illumination coming from the small lamp I had left on. I turned on the kitchen light, shining it into every dark space, looking for any sign that someone might be here. Nothing. I checked the bathroom, the closets, even the cabinets. Every single space was empty. The apartment felt eerily still, too still. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, but nothing else. No sounds of movement, no hidden footsteps, just silence. But then my phone buzzed again. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The same unknown number. "I'm behind you." I spun around, my eyes wide, searching the room in a panic. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly backed away toward the kitchen. The apartment was still silent. Nothing had changed. No one was there. I checked the door to the apartment. Locked. I checked the windows, also locked. Everything was as it should be. But the messages kept coming, each one more unnerving than the last. "I see you. Don't turn around." Unti. I had no idea how the person knew I was alone, or how they had gotten inside. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to wait to find out what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, not caring if I was overreacting anymore. The elevator was too slow, and I didn't want to wait. I took the stairs, my feet pounding on the steps as I made my way to the ground floor, trying to ignore the buzzing panic in my chest. When I reached the front door of the building, I hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But when I stepped outside into the night, I felt a bit of relief. The cool air hit my face, grounding me. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I checked my phone again, my stomach sank. A new message had come through. "I'm still here, watching you." I stood frozen, staring at the screen. I wasn't sure whether to go back inside to call the police or to run far away. My mind was spinning and nothing made sense. It was like I was trapped in some nightmare, unable to wake up. I glanced back at the building, wondering if the person had followed me, or if they were still inside, just waiting for me to make the wrong move. I looked around, trying to spot anyone suspicious, but the street was empty. The only sound a distant hum of city traffic. I didn't know what to do. Should I go back inside? Was it safe? But I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I stepped back into that apartment, I'd be walking straight into whatever was waiting for me. I kept the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether I should reply or ignore it. The fear gnawing at me was almost suffocating, but I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay out here forever, but I didn't want to go back in and risk whatever was lurking inside. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the darkened doorway of my apartment building. My hands trembled as I typed a response. "Who are you?" I hit send. The reply came instantly. "Does it matter?" I felt a cold shiver run through me. Story 5. I had just returned from a meeting at work, still carrying the weight of a long, stressful day. The office was quiet as I walked through the corridors, the hum of computers and the murmur of distant conversations filling the space. I was lost in my thoughts, wondering how I was going to manage the tasks ahead when I walked past one of my colleagues, Sam. "Hey, it's good to see you, Sparky," Sam called out with a bright grin, clearly in a good mood. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart sinking. The nickname. Sparky, a name I hadn't heard in years, not since I was a kid. I turned to look at Sam, my mind struggling to process the fact that they had just used it so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Sparky?" I asked, trying to sound casual though my voice faltered. "How do you?" "Oh, just how it is," Sam replied, shrugging and walking away, still smiling. "You've always had that spark, right?" I stood there frozen, my stomach dropping. The name had been given to me by my older brother when we were little. I hadn't heard it in years, not since I left home to go to college. I hadn't shared it with anyone, not even close friends or colleagues. No one knew about it, not unless they were a part of my childhood. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. How did Sam know about it? I'd never mentioned it, never once even thought about it until now. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't like Sam had heard it from someone else. They had used it so easily, so confidently, like they had been calling me that name for years. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe Sam had heard it from a family member or something. But as the day wore on, I found it harder to focus. Every time I crossed paths with Sam, I could feel their gaze on me, as if they were waiting for me to say something more. The nickname hovered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept circling back to Sam and the nickname. I tried to think of ways they could have known it, but nothing made sense. Had someone in my family mentioned it? Maybe my brother had slipped up and told someone. But even then, how could it have reached Sam? It wasn't like my family and my colleagues were connected in any way. The next morning, I decided to confront Sam. I walked up to them at the coffee machine, trying to keep my tone casual. "Hey Sam, about that nickname, how do you know about it?" Sam looked at me with a confused expression. "What do you mean? Sparky? I thought I heard it from you before. You said it was a nickname your parents used to call you." I felt the blood drain from my face. That was a lie. I had never told Sam that. I had never told anyone that. My parents had never used that nickname when I was older, not even in front of my friends. It wasn't something I had shared with anyone outside of my childhood. No, I've never said that," I replied, my voice shaky. "I've never mentioned it to anyone." Sam seemed to grow uncomfortable, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. "Oh well, maybe I don't know, heard it somewhere. I thought you had said it. My bad." I tried to laugh it off, but the unease in my chest only grew stronger. Sam seemed sincere enough, but the lie they had just told didn't sit right with me. How had they known that name? Who had told them? And why would they act like it was no big deal, like it was something I had openly shared when I hadn't? The rest of the day was a blur of tension. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I saw Sam, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. They weren't acting like they had made a simple mistake. They were acting like they knew something they shouldn't. The way they smiled at me, the way they kept looking over at me, made it feel like they were waiting for me to acknowledge something, to say something that would make sense of it all. That night, I took out my phone and checked through my old messages and social media accounts, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain how Sam knew about the nickname. But there was nothing. There were no mentions of Sparky, no old photos, no conversations that might have slipped through the cracks. I sat there, staring at the screen, growing more frustrated by the minute. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just some random mix-up. Sam hadn't made a mistake. They knew something they shouldn't have. They knew a part of me that I had kept hidden, a part of my past that no one at work should have known about. The thought of it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a connection to a part of me that I had buried, a part of my childhood that I didn't want to revisit. And yet Sam had pulled it out, as if it were some simple, harmless thing, like they had been a part of that past all along. The next morning, I decided to keep my distance from Sam. I tried to act normal, to keep things professional, but the tension between us had shifted. I didn't know if Sam was toying with me or if they were simply oblivious to the unease they had caused, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow watching me, waiting for me to react. As the day went on, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to hear the nickname again, but it didn't come. Sam was quiet, as if they had forgotten about it entirely, but I couldn't forget. The mystery of how they knew about the nickname, how they had slipped into a part of my past that no one else had access to, kept gnawing at me. And no matter how many times I asked myself the question, the answer remained the same. I couldn't trust them. Story 6. A6. I woke up to the sudden shrill of my phone alarm. Groggy, I reached over to silence it, but something made me hesitate as I saw the screen. The label for the alarm wasn't anything familiar. There was a name I didn't recognize. It wasn't a name I had ever entered myself, not as a contact, not for a calendar event, nothing. It simply read, Darren. I stared at the phone, still half asleep. My fingers hovered over the screen. I tried to shake the fogginess from my mind. Who was Darren? I didn't know anyone by that name, at least not that I could recall. I couldn't even think of a reason why that name would be tied to my alarm. I quickly turned off the phone, dismissing the alarm, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was some glitch in the system, or a random name that had somehow attached itself to the alarm setting. But the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. My phone was something I kept organized. My alarms were labeled with things I recognized, like wake up, meeting, or pick up groceries. There was no Darren. I hadn't set any alarm under that name. I ran through the possibilities. Maybe someone had borrowed my phone recently, but I didn't remember lending it to anyone. Even then, why would they set an alarm under a name like that? The whole thing didn't make sense, but I tried to push it aside. It wasn't worth overthinking. I went on with my morning, though the name lingered in my mind, irritatingly persistent. The next day, the alarm went off again at the same time. This time, the name was still there, unchanged Darren. My heart skipped a beat as I picked up the phone, my mind racing. I checked my recent calls, messages, and contacts. Nothing. No Darren. There was no record of anyone with that name in my phone history. No unknown number had texted me or called recently. I had no connection to this person, and yet here they were, showing up in my life without warning. I tried to find the source. Maybe it was some kind of app or setting I had forgotten about, some random notification I had missed. I opened my alarm settings and searched through everything, but there was nothing. No Darren listed anywhere in the settings, no trace of why that name would show up in the label. I even searched for the name Darren in my contacts, messages, and notes, convinced there must be some explanation. But there was nothing. No one named Darren had ever been in my phone. That night, I set the alarm again, determined to figure this out. I made sure everything was as it should be, the label cleared, and no reminders attached. But when the alarm went off the next morning, the name was back, Darren. It was like someone had taken control of my phone, inserting that name back without me doing a thing. Panic started to settle in. I was starting to feel like I was losing control over my own device. How could this happen? How was this name attached to my phone without my doing? I even reset my phone, hoping that would clear any potential issues. But when the alarm rang the next day, the name was still there, as if mocking me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know who Darren was. The name had become a ghost haunting my waking hours, a constant reminder of something I couldn't understand. I started to retrace my steps, going over conversations, people I'd met, places I'd been. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't recall ever meeting or hearing about anyone named Darren. The situation only deepened my anxiety. I checked my phone's security settings to see if anyone had access to it remotely, but everything seemed locked down. Still, the feeling that something or someone was messing with me wouldn't go away. 2 weeks passed, and every morning, like clockwork, Darren showed up on my phone. No one ever responded to me when I tried texting the number. There were no clues. The more I searched, the less I found. Then, one evening, I received a text from an unknown number. I opened it cautiously, and there it was, a single line of text. "I told you I'd be watching." My heart pounded in my chest as I read the message over and over, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The name Darren wasn't a random glitch. It wasn't a coincidence. Whoever Darren was, they were real and they were watching me in ways I couldn't yet understand. Story 7. I was walking home from the grocery store, the bags heavy in my arms, my mind consumed with the usual end-of-day thoughts what to make for dinner, whether I'd get the laundry done. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm orange glow across the street. It was a peaceful evening, the kind where everything feels calm and safe, and you don't expect anything out of the ordinary. As I passed the small park near my house, a voice broke through the silence. It was soft, almost hesitant, yet clear enough to catch my attention. I turned, looking around for the source. A child no older than 8 or 9 stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at me with wide, curious eyes. She was alone, dressed in a little blue dress that seemed too nice for playing outside. Her hair was braided neatly, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. It wasn't just the innocent speck from a child, it was something else, something strange. She took a small step closer and asked, "Why are you pretending to be someone else?" I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The question caught me off guard. My mind raced to process it, but nothing seemed to make sense. What was she talking about? Pretending to be someone else? I wasn't pretending to be anyone. I was just me, walking home from the store. I glanced around, hoping to see a parent or someone nearby, but the street was empty. It was just me and the girl, standing in the fading light. "Excuse me," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean?" The child didn't flinch or look away. She simply stared at me, her expression almost too serious for her age. "You're pretending," she repeated, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You're not who you say you are." My stomach churned. The more she spoke, the more I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself it was just a kid being odd, but the weight of her words stuck with me, gnawing at my insides. What did she mean? Was I pretending? Who did she think I was? I looked down at myself, the grocery bag still in my hands, the simple clothes I wore, nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't pretending to be anyone. I was just going about my day like I always did. The girl's eyes didn't waver. She stepped closer, her small hand reaching out slightly, like she was going to touch my sleeve. I took a step back, feeling an unfamiliar wave of unease settle in my chest. "Who do you think I am?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I intended. The question felt strange coming from me, but it was all I could think to say. The child didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head as if weighing something in her mind. And then, finally, she spoke again, her voice low and deliberate. "You're not her. You're pretending to be her." The words hit me like a punch. A sharp, icy feeling ran through my veins, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I couldn't understand what she was saying. Who was I pretending to be? Who was her? I glanced down at the child again, her face unreadable, yet there was something in her eyes, something that made my skin crawl. I could feel my pulse quicken as the familiar warmth of the evening seemed to slip away, replaced by an oppressive weight. The girl turned and began walking away, her small footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. As she got farther, I found myself rooted to the spot, still trying to process what had just happened. She didn't look back, but as she disappeared around the corner, she muttered one last thing, just loud enough for me to hear. "You'll remember eventually." I stood there, frozen, as the last of the evening light faded. The grocery bags felt heavier in my hands, the weight of the conversation still heavy in my chest. What did she mean by that? I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the question gnawed at me. Was I pretending to be someone else? And if so, who? I slowly turned and made my way home, the world around me suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as if the ground had shifted beneath me while I wasn't looking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that something was different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. When I got inside, I put the groceries away and tried to focus on something else. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the little girl's words lingered. "You're not her. You're pretending to be her." I couldn't stop thinking about it. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked at myself, really looked. Who was I? What did I see? I felt a chill run through me, a sudden doubt creeping into my thoughts. Was I pretending to be someone else? Or was it just a child's strange comment, a weird thing to brush off? I still don't have an answer, but I can't seem to shake the question. Every time I pass a mirror, every time I glance at my reflection, I wonder if it's truly me staring back, or someone else entirely. Story 8. It was one of those mornings where everything felt off. I woke up late, rushed through my routine, and found myself running to catch the bus. The usual crowd filled the sidewalk as I hurried to work, clutching my coffee cup in one hand and my phone in the other, trying to make sure everything was in order. I was running on autopilot, barely noticing the world around me. But as I reached the corner of 5th and Main, something caught my attention. A voice that wasn't mine. I paused for a moment, looking around, confused. It wasn't someone talking to me, it was someone on the phone, standing close by. I didn't recognize the voice, but what caught my attention was the conversation they were having. They were speaking loudly, casually, but the words, they sent a chill down my spine. "She's wearing the navy blue jacket, the one with the zipper pocket on the left side," the stranger said, their voice cool and detached. "And the dark jeans, the ones with the frayed cuffs. She's just past the coffee shop on 5th, heading toward the bus stop. She'll be there in about 2 minutes." I froze. My mind raced, my heartbeat quickened, and the world around me seemed to blur for a moment. I stood still, trying to process what I was hearing. The person on the other end of the phone call didn't know me. They couldn't possibly. I didn't recognize their voice, but the details, every single one, were about me. My outfit, my location, the path I was taking. It felt like a strange coincidence at first, but then the details began piling up, one after the other, until it became undeniable. The jacket I was wearing had a zipper pocket exactly where they described. The jeans I'd chosen that morning had the frayed cuffs. I had just passed the coffee shop on 5th, and sure enough, I was heading toward the bus stop. It was as if they were watching me, tracking me in real time. I tried to keep my composure, but my thoughts were scattered. Was I being followed? Was I overreacting? I slowly turned my head, trying to spot the person who was speaking on the phone. The street was busy, as it usually was during rush hour, but I couldn't pinpoint the voice's source. I didn't see anyone around who seemed to be talking into a phone, but the voice was still clear, still precise. The stranger continued speaking, oblivious to the fact that I was listening. "Watch for the red scarf around her neck," they said. "It's the same one she wears every Wednesday. She'll be distracted by her phone, like always, probably texting someone." I glanced down at my neck, the red scarf wrapped loosely around it. I hadn't even thought about it. I always wore it on Wednesdays, just like the stranger had said. I looked back toward the bus stop, my stomach turning. They knew too much. This wasn't just a lucky guess. This was real. I was starting to panic. I had no idea what to do. I should have kept walking, acted normal, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, barely able to breathe. Was I being followed? Was someone watching me right now? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I quickly glanced down at it, relieved to see that it was just a text from my friend, asking if I was almost at the bus stop. I quickly typed a response, trying to distract myself, but my hands were shaking. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of a person speaking on the phone, but still, I couldn't find anyone who seemed suspicious. "They're almost there," the voice continued, now speaking even more quietly. "She's just checking the time on her phone. But watch for her to pull her coat around her shoulders. She's doing it right now." I glanced down, horrified. I was pulling my coat around my shoulders just as the voice had said. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. They were watching me. They were describing everything I did, every move I made. I couldn't take it anymore. I started walking faster, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the voice was still there, still in my ears, narrating every detail of my movements. "She's walking faster now. She's heading toward the bus, almost there. She won't notice, not yet." I glanced up, my heart pounding. The bus stop was in sight. I picked up my pace, hoping to blend into the crowd. I reached the bus stop just as the bus pulled up, feeling a rush of relief as I climbed aboard. The voice, still in my head, stopped. The strange commentary ceased the moment I stepped onto the bus, and for the first time in minutes, I could breathe again. I took a seat near the back of the bus, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I glanced around, looking for anyone who might have been following me. But the bus was full of familiar faces, people who commuted with me every day, people who I knew by sight, but not by name. There was no one who stood out, no one who looked suspicious. But the voice was still in my head. Even now, as I sat there, trying to convince myself it was all in my mind, the words echoed. "They know what I'm wearing. They know where I am. They know everything." I tried to focus on my phone, to distract myself from the overwhelming sense of unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That someone out there, someone who knew everything about me, was still keeping track of every step I took. When I arrived at my stop, I made a quick decision. I couldn't go home like this, not with that lingering sense of being watched. I needed to figure out what was going on. Who was watching me? Why were they watching me? I decided to head straight to the police station. I had to report it, even if I didn't have solid proof. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just coincidence. The fact that someone had been able to describe my every move in real time, even the smallest details, how I checked my phone, how I pulled my coat tight around me, was too much to ignore. As I made my way toward the station, I tried to shake the feeling of being followed, but the voices in my head were louder now. Every little noise, every glance over my shoulder felt like a sign. Were they still out there, watching me from the shadows? Were they tracking my every step? By the time I reached the station, I had no answers, just a growing sense of dread. Whatever had happened, whatever was happening, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I had no idea who was behind the phone call, or why they had chosen me. But I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't a coincidence. And whatever it wasn't going away. Story 9. It was a typical morning, or at least it should have been. I woke up early, as I always do, and started my usual routine. I walked into the bathroom, feeling groggy but ready to face the day. The bathroom light flickered on with a soft buzz, and I immediately went to the sink. I ran the water, splashed my face, and brushed my teeth. But as I reached for my toothbrush, I froze. It was the toothbrush I had left on the counter the night before, the one I always used. It sat right there, exactly where I had left it, but it was damp. I hadn't touched it since I had used it the previous night, so why was it wet? I stood there, staring at it for a long moment. The bristles were not only damp, they were soaked, as though someone had just used it. But there was no explanation for it. I lived alone. There was no one else in the house. I hadn't even been near the bathroom since I had brushed my teeth before bed. I hadn't even opened the door until now. I picked up the toothbrush, my fingers trembling as I felt the dampness. The water wasn't fresh, not like it had just been rinsed under the tap. It had the kind of wetness that lingered, the kind that suggested it had been left like that for a while. I looked around the bathroom, my heart beating faster. Was someone in the house? I checked the window, but it was locked. The door was bolted shut. Everything was as it should be, except for the toothbrush. I set the toothbrush down quickly, as if it might somehow reveal more if I touched it again. I went to the kitchen to get a cup of coffee, but my mind kept returning to that moment in the bathroom. How could the toothbrush be wet if I hadn't used it? There was no logical explanation. I wasn't the type to forget things, especially not something as simple as brushing my teeth before bed. I thought about the possibility of it being a mistake. Maybe I had used it the night before and forgotten. No. I was certain I hadn't. I could recall the details of my evening vividly. I had made dinner, watched a bit of TV, then went to bed as usual. I never once went back into the bathroom after brushing my teeth, and yet the toothbrush was wet, as though someone had used it in the night. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. Perhaps I had accidentally splashed water on it when I was washing my hands, though that didn't explain the dampness that felt different. It wasn't like water that splashes around carelessly, it was more intentional, as if the toothbrush had been used for something. I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. Something wasn't right. Later that day, I went out for groceries, hoping to distract myself. But every time I picked up an item, I found my thoughts drifting back to that damn toothbrush. Was I losing my mind, or had someone been in my house? I kept replaying the event over and over in my head. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe there was a simple explanation I hadn't considered. When I returned home, I hesitated before entering the bathroom again. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The toothbrush was still there, sitting exactly where I had left it. I didn't touch it this time. Instead, I kept my eyes on it, half expecting it to do something strange, move, perhaps, or change in some way. But it remained still, its dampness unchanged. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to figure it out. That night, I took extra care to make sure everything was in place. I checked the door locks, ensured the windows were secure, and even set up an alarm system that I had been meaning to install for weeks. I brushed my teeth before bed as usual and placed my toothbrush back on the counter, the same spot it always occupied. I woke up the next morning with a sense of unease hanging over me. I didn't want to go into the bathroom, afraid of what I might find, but I had to know. Slowly, I walked toward the counter. I didn't even want to look at the toothbrush, but my eyes were drawn to it. There it was, sitting there once again, wet and glistening. It was as if it had been used, just like the morning before. My heart pounded in my chest. I had done everything right. I had locked the door, secured the house. No one had entered. But still, the toothbrush was damp, the bristles soaked as if someone had brushed their teeth with it during the night. I felt the panic rising in my throat, a deep sense of dread settling over me. I hadn't used it. I had no memory of anyone else using it either, so how was it wet again? I had to get answers. I couldn't just ignore this anymore. I decided to check the bathroom more thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. I checked the sink, the shower, the mirror, everything. Nothing seemed out of place. There was no sign of anyone else being in the room, no clues left behind. It was all as I had left it, but the toothbrush was still wet. I tried calling a friend to talk about it, but the call went straight to voicemail. I needed someone to help me make sense of it, to tell me I was just imagining things. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. It wasn't just the toothbrush. It was the feeling that came with it. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the background. I left the house again, but no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there with me, following me, waiting for me to return home. The sense of dread grew stronger as the day wore on. I kept thinking about the toothbrush. I kept thinking about what it meant. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just an accident or a coincidence. Something was happening, and I was too afraid to face it. When I finally came back home, the thought of checking the bathroom filled me with dread. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stay away any longer. I opened the door, my pulse racing. The toothbrush was still there, still wet. And this time, something had changed. The bristles weren't just damp, they were slick, coated in something that wasn't water. My stomach lurched as I stared at it, the realization dawning on me. Something was using my toothbrush, and it wasn't me. Story 10. The sound of the doorbell rang through my house, startling me from my thoughts. I glanced out the window and saw the delivery truck pulling away, leaving behind a plain cardboard box on my doorstep. I didn't remember ordering anything recently, but I bent down to grab it anyway. It had my name on it, but there was no return address, just a simple label with my home address and nothing more. Curious, I carried the package inside, setting it down on the kitchen table. The box felt heavier than I expected, its edges slightly worn, as if it had traveled some distance. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface, wondering if it was some sort of mistake. Maybe a mix-up in delivery. Maybe it was for one of my neighbors. I grabbed a knife and carefully cut through the tape, the sharp sound echoing through the quiet house. As I peeled back the cardboard flaps, I felt a strange sense of anticipation building in my chest. Inside was an item I had never ordered, but one I had dreamed about for years. A limited edition vintage camera, its sleek black body gleaming under the light. It wasn't just any camera. It was the camera I had always wanted but never had the money to buy, the one I had saved up for, only to have to spend the money elsewhere when life threw its curveballs. My breath caught in my throat. How was this possible? I stared at the camera, my hands trembling as I picked it up, the weight of it familiar, comforting. But it wasn't right. I hadn't bought it. I hadn't even looked at it in months. I hadn't told anyone about it. The only time I'd ever mentioned it was years ago to a close friend who I hadn't spoken to in ages. I checked the box again, looking for a clue, anything that might explain how it had arrived. There was no packing slip, no note, just the camera. No hint as to who had sent it or why. I could feel my pulse quickening as I looked around, half expecting someone to be standing outside the window, watching me. It didn't make sense. No one I knew would have sent this to me. I set the camera down, staring at it for a long moment. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened.